Imagine, you are a gamer otaku who is transported to another world, but there you are the biggest failure and everyone laughs in your face, but suddenly you become a fairy tamer and the most powerful being in this world. You are watching the anime Demon Spirit Seed Manual first season in full, so leave a like to support the project and let's just go. Right from the start we see a glorious and majestic kingdom and several people who appear to be fighting an incredible battle. We are at the opening of the anime. We then see an angelic being with red hair wondering where that person was, as he can't find it no matter how hard he looks. The scene changes to a boy who was packing his bags to travel to an otaku city full of anime stuff and Donghuas. The boy walks happily until boarding the plane, but in the meantime he crosses realities, but he doesn't realize it because he is focused on the music that is playing. When he least expects it, he is almost run over by a species of dinosaur. He is distracted by several mystical beings moving around using magic, but he thinks he is in the otaku park. Finally, he realized he was in another world after seeing dragons flying through the sky. But he accepts reality quickly and remembers the anime and thinks that he is a protagonist, so he will soon become very strong and form a harem. A man asks if he is the young man who came from another country to the magic school, and he confidently says yes, as he has read what it is like in novels and now he is going to demonstrate his incredible power of protagonism. But he fails the test, leaving him completely embarrassed. The supervisors explain that each color means a magic and the light that came out was from no magic, meaning he has no abilities. They even see a thread of wooden magic, but they tell him to return when he has more power and he leaves the room desolate, wondering if it shouldn't be like this. After that he continues training and reciting "Come my power of hack" in a tree. But he fails again, and while he is whining on the floor about being transported to be useless, a little man helps him with motivation and asks him to be a gardener with him. And so that's how he became a gardener. In his words, it's not majestic at all, but he still manages to use his woodworking skills and survive in this world. Until he hears a strange noise coming from the forest and comes across a guy being cattle for a girl there, and he is discovered and pretends to be a cat meowing like in an episode of Keys and fails miserably and starts running away. And he fails at this again, being captured, and finally the girl goes to him and threatens him that if he heard anything, it's better to keep his mouth shut. Back at the man's house at night, he is very depressed, but the man tells him that in his youth he also sought power and tells him about fairies and that he found a fairy seed. The young man is already excited, but the man says that he has already tried to plant the seed in different ways but was unsuccessful. And the young man explains that you are an NPC and Nav could do it and he will do everything to make the seed grow and you are encouraged. And finally he spends his days trying to make the seed grow so he can finally have his dream hat. He then tries different types of rituals to remove the seal until he tries the blood seal and it doesn't work and he goes back down, but he didn't see the glow in the seed. Apparently it works. So he explores the forest at night and meets the cattle again with that girl, only this time she cosplays as Tokyo Ghoul Rise and devours one of the guys there, completely draining his vital energy. One has already moved on from this for the better. The other tries to fight with the girl who turns out to be a succubus but fails miserably, and she also drains his vital energy using her plant magic. After that, Snoop Dogg's spider is creating one there and the boy runs away so there won't be any left for him. But the succubus quickly catches up with him, traps him and drains his life energy as well. And finally, as his life slips away, the magic is activated and he makes a connection with that mystical being that we saw at the beginning and that appears to be the seed fairy. And when he thought he was finally going to gain power and be the owner of the fairy, she says she came from hell to take his life. Yeah, this guy is the unluckiest of all isekai anime. But soon after the demon is surprised by him. It's who she was looking for years, and when the succubus was going to execute her because she thought she was stealing her prey, she decides to use the succubus as a sacrifice to save the boy's life. And the boy finally wakes up and gets all excited as he believes she will serve him, and she reveals that she actually saved him so she can execute him with her own hands. And apparently she knows him, but he doesn't know her, and said that she will make him pay for the imprisonment in the seal he put her in and will attack him, but every attack she makes is reflected back to her. In other words, she can't hurt him, only herself. And the school principal appears and says that it's like in the legends, and for the fairy to calm down, and that if she hurts her master again she will end up hurting herself again. And the director gives him the fairy manual that was inherited by the school directors, and a power emanates over the boy and he recites some words while he is out of his own consciousness and imprisons the fairy in the book. After that, she invites him to her quarters at the academy, and there she talks to him and threatens him to enter the academy to continue using the book and to be her student too. Nothing the protagonist didn't already want, right? He's finally getting lucky. But the biggest condition is that he meets the academy's succubi. He refuses, but the director shows him 3 more fairy seeds and asks if he really doesn't want the rewards. And the boy quickly accepts to the point of bowing, as he has a weakness for collecting items, and the director already brags in her thoughts about having the only student who possesses fairy magic. Anyway, the boy goes to the new room at the academy and discovers that the greater the fairy's affinity with his master, the greater the spiritual power according to the book. Then a voice echoes from the book that is not case would be the manual system that he has, and reveals several things to him, including that he needs power to enter the fairy world, and that the fairy is actually a very powerful female being who was converted into a fairy by a spell. And the guy already brags about being the master, but the system already tells him that he will have to conquer the fairy because she is not obliged to obey despite being his fairy. Then the system becomes a cell phone application application so that the protagonist can move around and take it with greater ease. The next day he goes to his first day of class, and the murmurs of the other students are visible, and he greets some but everyone avoids him, until some students, jealous of him entering the academy without an exam, decide to try to embarrass him. And he picks up the crystal from the ground, but this time the crystal reveals a gigantic power, and now with a double element, water and wood. He probably inherited the power of water from the fairy or succubus that was sacrificed so he could live. And everyone is amazed. The crystal explodes and he hears from the students that his level of qualification is very high. He's no fool. He already uses this to hit on a girl he thought was pretty. She runs away, shy and embarrassed, and he comes to his senses and wonders what happened because his body reacted on its own. It wasn't him. The manual then appears on his cell phone in a cute personification and explains to him that he has absorbed both the power of the succubus and the fairy, apart from the ability to enchant that was acquired, which would be independent of sex or race. Everyone will be attracted to him. After that he talks to some girls. The students feel jealous, and then he dies in a 10,000-meter race and wonders why this is in a magic school. #maximum level sedentary lifestyle. Then the teacher introduces himself and says that he will train them to be at the height of combat, and one of the students suggests that they test this in combat, and the teacher supports it. And the boy who previously envied the protagonist challenges him and he refuses, but the teacher puts pressure on him and he accepts. A princess from a great empire arrives out of nowhere to watch the fight, making our protagonist even more nervous. The opponent attacks him, but a barrier saves him, and the fairy starts talking to him, telling him not to risk hurting himself like an idiot, to summon him as soon as she finishes him off in seconds. But he refuses, and listening to the teacher's advice to accumulate power and attack, he does so, defeating the opponent with just one blow. And then he passes out from exhaustion, and curiously he is transported to the fairy world, where his memories reside, and he meets a version of the fairy when she was little and was in the middle of a war with hunger and cold. For some reason, he is able to interact with people in this memory, and takes care of the little girl who is feeling sick. Then some idiots appear to take the little girl to sell her, but he fights bravely for her and ends up being beaten, but he continues to protect her, and the little girl thanks him, and finally he realizes that she is the fairy, and is transported to some kind of space inside her mind, but wakes up with the manual calling him, and explains that he was in the fairy's inner world, and there is the key to conquering her, as his obsessions lie there. So he becomes interested in the fairy's story and summons her on his cell phone to talk to her, and she questions why he didn't summon her to fight, and he says that he wants to respect her decisions and doesn't want to force her to do anything, and he claps sarcastically saying you will believe him this time. He asks if it's serious, and she says of course not, and points the sword at him, but they are interrupted by two girls and a guy entering the infirmary and apparently going to do things they shouldn't do in the gym. But at that moment we remember that there are succubi in the gym, but the protagonist shows up, and then a group appears via chat between the manual and the fairy, where they are both making fun of him in the group. And at that moment the boy next door had already become food for the succubi, and then the princess Knight appears, and the succubi seem to be his servants. Now back at the gardener's house, he was worried about everything, but he decides to really worry about his dinner, and then he feels someone coming. He hears a female voice and someone opening the door, so he immediately punches him in the face, and actually it was the princess. But I didn't really tank that punch in the face, I laughed horribly. So he drags her inside, puts her on the bed, and lays down in the corner of the bed. Since there was only one bed and sleeps, this guy is very random and flirtatious. And soon after the girl wakes up, and of course the guy had moved and at that point was already hugging her. He wakes up scared looking for succubus. And now it's his turn to be punched in the face and attacked several times by the princess. Then he explains that she passed out in front of his house and he took her to bed. That's all, and she complains about how dare he let a princess sleep in such a low quality bed, and here we see that she is that spoiled type. So he uses the instant noodles he had in his suitcase to feed the princess who loves the taste. Then he connects the pieces and understands that she is alone is part of the plan he heard before. But it's too late. The succubi have already invaded the house and are now heading to find them, but the boy is ingenious and quickly loses them and makes them fall into his trap, trapping them with his plant magic. And then he takes the opportunity to escape and tells the princess that she is very naive, that now they are going to play hide and seek, and that if she wins he will give her more instant noodles. So he finally summons the fairy to battle the succubi, and she is absurdly powerful. She treats the succubi as real extras, invoking various magics and humiliating them, until when she was about to execute them, the princess's knight appears to save them. But in reality, he finished them both off with just one blow. But the fairy doesn't accept it. She says she's going to finish him off so she can finally take revenge on the protagonist, and the protagonist gets all confused because for him, he didn't do anything. The fairy is losing. The manual says that the way to help is for him to improve his affinity with her, so she will gain more power, but he doesn't have time. All he has to do is enter the inner world to do this, but there's no magic either. But when everything seemed lost, the princess appears, and she all silly says she can give him spiritual energy as long as he asks for it, and the knight will attack her, but the fairy stops him. And finally he asks the princess to close her eyes because it will be a new game worth 1 year of instant noodles, of course so that she doesn't see what is happening, betrayal and everything else, to preserve the girl, and asks her to help with the spiritual energy. The fairy protects him from a brutal attack by the knight, and he finally manages to reach the fairy's inner world. And now we see the fairy in the past defending herself in that dark world from some bandits, but unlike the other time, now he can't interact with her, he just sees her story. and the manual says that in this case, it already exists in this world. And the scene cuts to the fairy in the bar with her murder contractor. She takes the money, leaves and comes across a guy who is clearly the protagonist but with long hair and trying to buy his sword, but he says it's not for sale. The protagonist also notices that he has the same face, and then it's the day-to-day life of the fairy and this version of the protagonist's past life. Until some bandits decide to attack a girl who was a friend of the protagonist's past version, and he protects her, but only with his back receiving the attacks without hurting the bandits. And the fairy sees him protecting the child and remembers the other boy who protected her as a child, which is really crazy because the guy came from the future and affected the past, and we're messing with Timeline's friends, and I don't know if we're in the Flash or in Rick and Morty. The bandits recognize her and run in fear when she holds one of their hands, preventing the attacks. And she was about to leave, but he decided to give her the sword as thanks. And she says that if anything, just say that he is under her protection. In this, our protagonist, who observes everything, already realizes that he is a great calculator and that he is manipulating the fairy. And he explains in detail how everything that happened so far was planned so that the fairy would fall in love with him and that she is in great danger. Back to the present, the princess's spiritual energy is already on its last legs, and the fairy continues fighting to protect the protagonist. After all, if he gets hurt, all the damage will go to her, but she is also on her last legs in that fierce battle against the knight. So she allows herself to be pierced so that she can use her blood with magic to trap him, but time has a limit. Only while she still has blood will she be able to trap him, and she looks at the protagonist with an already icy gaze. Back to the inner world of the fairy, the protagonist has been cursing his other version for over an hour as he can't do anything until the other version speaks to him, who says that he can hear him because they have the same soul. And they exchange some barbs, and the other version, which we will now call the imposter, goes to the fairy's house, who welcomes him by placing the sword on his neck. He jokes about her receptive manner, and she says that they don't usually knock on her door, after which he shows her what he took for her and says that he will come back another day trying to seduce her. And the protagonist only hates there, until the imposter takes the fairy for a walk on the pier, where he says that it is incredible to find a place that has peace in a city where you can be murdered at any moment, and mentions other cities, and his favorite is where he comes from, a place full of flowers as far as the eye can see, and that I would like to show her one day away from that city where all the criminals in the country gather. The other day she was returning from an execution that she orchestrated, and she sees him and hides the sword and looks embarrassed. My friends, the imposter trick has already worked. She is completely in love. After that, the imposter keeps visiting her under the pretext of bringing her food and gradually enchants her. I don't even want to know where this is going, and I can already understand her anger. Oh, the guy keeps acting like Donghua there, Peak Sanji from One Piece, and seduces her with his food and delicacy there. After that they exchange half words there. The guy talks some nonsense that I'm already out of patience for this cheap manipulation. And the fairy says that when she found him, she remembered the feeling of someone very kind who protected her when she was little. So she goes to accept a dangerous job for double the price to have money to move out of the city, and the contractor gives her advice, who realizes that she is in love and says that she can choose whoever she wants, but that boy will do her a lot of harm. That happiness doesn't appear out of nowhere and that she will regret it, and she takes the money and says she will come back for the rest tomorrow after the service. And the contractor just watches and thinks that she will regret it, and the protagonist on the side agrees with the contractor. Then she comes back and shows the ticket to leave the city and go to that place full of flowers that she bought for the two of them. And she says that just one more job and she can go, and he says that in 3 days he will be waiting for her at the lighthouse. She finishes her work, packs her things, and when she is leaving she receives insults from some drunks who were making fun of her leaving the territory of criminals. And they beg for their lives, and she just smiles and says it's nice weather and smiles and walks away while the guys are standing there with their tails between their legs. She goes to the lighthouse and stays there looking stupid, and the protagonist watching everything just like us. Time passes and nothing from the imposter. 3 days and 3 nights have passed and she hasn't left the place. Now in the rain she's still waiting. It's really sad. The protagonist himself drops some tears and tries to make her hear him by shouting, but she can't hear him. His voice doesn't reach her. The contractor goes to her location and asks if she will wait for death there, that this is a trap from another district of the city and for her to get back on her feet. Finally, the lighthouse is attacked by explosion and the contractor quickly saves the fairy. So the fairy goes into battle while remembering all the imposter's promises and finally comes to the reality that it was all to deceive her. When leaving the place, letting some tears fall, she is surrounded and the bandits threaten to execute the same little girl from before who was with the imposter. They tell her to back off if she doesn't want her to end up like the boy. She quickly executes everyone and hugs the little girl who said she was scared. And in that moment of low guard, the girl herself stabs the fairy and leaves the crying girl character, and the imposter appears. Next we see the imposter next to the little girl who stabbed the fairy, and she still extends her hand to the imposter who just watches her, and the little girl says that it really was too easy to deceive her. Then the leader of the enemy district approaches and tells her the whole plan of the imposter, that the imposter went to the leader of the other district and offered his services, and that if he collaborated, the fairy district would be his and the fairy would be the imposter's. The fairy clearly has a huge emotional shock and still staggers towards the imposter. The protagonist even tries to stop it, but the fairy cannot hear him. Then she remembers all the promises with a sad face, and 2 bandits hold her back. The head of the other district wants to execute the fairy, and the imposter is against it, all while her emotions are going down the drain. The imposter quickly summons the other fairies and executes the bandits who were no longer cooperating, and the fairy remains emotionally shaken. She finally gets up, the weather is already night, and she goes at the imposter with her katana, but another fairy blocks her attack. She fights fiercely, but the other fairy blocks all her attacks, until her sword breaks and she is wounded in the stomach and collapses to the ground. The protagonist watches closely with a sad face, but without being able to do anything. Then the imposter says that if she perishes it will be a shame, and offers her the chance to continue living but being reborn as a fairy, so that one day she can take revenge on him and not perish there. He says he travels the world looking for women with favorable characteristics to become a fairy, so she accepts that only revenge hangs over her head, and the ritual begins, crucifying her on a bloody thorn tree in exchange for immortality and power. The protagonist confronts him with words, but the imposter says he is just following the game's achievements, and he thinks the same no matter how angry he is at the moment. After all, they have the same soul and are the same person, according to the imposter. And the protagonist pulls him by the shirt and says that he came to this world just to save the fairy. The imposter just smiles and says that he is very weak, and when he becomes more powerful he will think the same as him. Then the imposter disappears, and the manual explains that he was just talking to a soul fragment, and they go back to where the fairy was crucified. So he decides to do the same as when the succubus injured him, and decides to stick a sword in his chest to release the fairy's seal, but if he fails to release the seal he could end up perishing, so he hesitates. And he even tears up because he feels so weak and powerless, but he promises that he will save the fairy. Until that inner world starts to get shaky, and he becomes more determined. He climbs the tree and decides to throw himself from an angle where the sword hits him right in the chest and finally activates the seal. At that moment he tells the fairy that he practically wanted to be a god in this new world, have a harem, be a hacker, but his vision has changed, and asks that, at least in his last moment, he acts like a protagonist and goes towards her, kissing her, and then throwing himself from the top of the tree. The fairy finally wakes up and now has all the memories of what the protagonist did in those last moments, and how he confronted the imposter, and even remembers when she was little and that he was actually the one who protected her. Finally, the fairy frees herself and now appears to have mastered her fairy form, but the protagonist is stretched out on the floor, apparently lifeless. She removes the sword fragment and laments that he really wasn't the imposter and had apparently perished, wondering why he did it. Why did he make her understand his feelings if he perished? How could she like someone dead, and burst into tears there on that plain where the sky crossed with the waters. She cries and asks him to come back to life. After all, he didn't say he would protect her. She was already leaving disappointed, but he shows signs of life. He holds her by the leg. She is surprised, and he says he was moved by such beautiful words and continues praising her. Already shy, she draws her sword and asks him to explain himself. He apologizes profusely. He just didn't want to interrupt her at that moment. She's a bit silly, accepts the apology and says not to repeat herself. And the manual says that he successfully conquered her. She blushes even more, and he asks if they could use the fusion technique that I have in the manual. They hold hands, and finally the protagonist leaves the inner world together with the fairy. And back in the real world, the princess was already exhausted. He carefully hugs her and puts her to rest. And the protagonist jokes that the Donghua must already be in episode 7, and at this point there is only one thing to do, which would be to activate the hack and call the fairy. They merge, thus giving the long-awaited hack to our protagonist, who now has a very powerful appearance with his scarlet aura. A fierce battle begins between the knight and our protagonist. He delivers several blows, both physical and magical, and the knight doesn't have the slightest chance. Truly something very magnificent to see. And he was going to use his most powerful fusion blow, but the manual says that time is running out, so he just chooses to throw a very powerful Saitama-style punch right in the face of the knight, who is completely surprised and amazed. And he was literally annihilated. The protagonist even breaks the fourth wall, saying that after the punch he turned into a mosaic, clearly indicating the censorship of the anime. But the fairy says that he is just passed out. The manual says that her feelings for the protagonist are now 100%, and he goes to her and cheers her up, saying that in this world there are many fun things that they can experience, and together they will rebuild her world. But he completely breaks the mood by touching her horns, and says it's very curious, and she beats him up. And the manual explains that fairies are like flowers, and the horns would be the pistil. In this case, the pistil is the flower's reproductive organ. And he says that now the fairy's feelings have gone negative, and he questions why the manual didn't warn him before, already with his face on the floor. The director appears while the protagonist tries to explain himself to the fairy, and thanks him for taking care of the 2 succubi and gives him 2 fairy seeds as promised. And he says he will take care of the knight and the princess, and tells him to keep what happened a secret. He agrees, sneaking out trying to avoid problems, and the director lets out a slight smile. Could she perhaps be the villain of this work? Finally the hack has been activated, and what will be the power of the other 2 fairies? Now back to the gym. The director arranged for the fairy, who we will now call Mo Fei, and the princess to be placed in the same class as the protagonist and presented as exchange students so as not to generate suspicion. Everyone is surprised at how beautiful they are, and the teacher tells them to sit down, and of course they choose the place next to the protagonist, leaving everyone dying with envy. The protagonist, who until now was dying of exhaustion sleeping at the table, wakes up confused and is surprised by the situation. And of course all the students die of envy and look at him with their eyes. And in the next scene the princess tells them to sleep together again, since he looks so tired. They played a lot yesterday Fei and she ended up sleeping, and then he was playing with just Mo Fei, and Mo Fei agrees with the princess, leaving everyone was amazed, and I clearly burst out laughing at these two. Because the protagonist was super embarrassed and the class was completely surprised, and all the men wanted to finish him off because they were so jealous. He runs away from the people who pursue him and finally goes to a kind of library to learn magic. There, the librarian gave him all the support, delivering the books he requested, which were to boost his seed growing and cultivation skills. And then the manual tells him that normal plant magic has no effect on fairy seeds and suggests absorbing the book he got from the library to help him better. And that's what the manual did. It absorbed the book, and with that the protagonist automatically leveled up. From there, the manual reveals the conditions of the seeds, and he meets the requirements and waits anxiously, but time passes and nothing happens. Then the scene changes to the knight from before, apologizing to his master, who looks very much like the imposter, but his face is not revealed. It would be a gigantic plot twist that he is still alive. They talk about some diplomatic things, and the leader of that castle orders him to execute the owner of the fairy so that she can be his. Back to the protagonist. After 7 days, one of the fairies has blossomed and he is very happy, but Mo Fei says that her form doesn't look very good, and the fairy questions why the twin flower didn't bloom too, and in her rage goes after the protagonist. The reluctant Mo Fei goes to defend him, but at the same moment another fairy blooms. Magnificently, a transformation it happens, Sailor Moon style, and finally the other fairy comes back to life, and the first fairy, who seemed to be very aggressive, is happy and says that she will not be separated from her anymore, and calls her big sister. The older fairy asks who he is, and he runs behind Mo Fei thinking she is another one trying to execute him, but she appears to be very kind and calls him master. For once he was lucky. The other questions her, and she says that it was a promise she made, and she says that in that case she will do the same as her sister. Double luck. Finally the protagonist is running away from his problems. The protagonist even cries with emotion, as he thought this would never happen, and the jealous Mo Fei already pulls the sword on him, and he comes to his senses and pretends to act professionally and stores them in the manual, and he celebrates, and Mo Fei already makes fun of the fact that 2 more innocent girls fell into the hands of a pervert, and he corrects her saying that it's just an obsession with collecting and that he's not a pervert. And he says that the imposter created many fairies and thinks about freeing them so they can choose their own destiny. In the next scene the protagonist will meet the director back. The director reveals that the knight is heading to the academy with an army and that he probably wants the princess and the protagonist because of the fairies. He is afraid. She asks if he regrets it and he replies no, that he will become stronger and free all. And she says that in this case he should leave the gym as soon as possible, and he gets confused. He then leaves with the princess from the academy and goes to another continent. The librarian asks him for help to collect more magic from this new place he will go, and gives him a stone that works as a kind of magic receptacle and has an entire system of rewards, everything the protagonist loves. And finally he leaves with the princess and Mo Fei and the fairies, for the princess's safety, and everyone says goodbye. Then in the forest, the manual absorbs the magic stone that the librarian gave, and the fairies find a lake and the protagonist goes after them. But arriving at the side he comes across a giant dragon. The dragon says he heard rumors about a human week with fairies and came to take the fairies from him, that his story has already spread across the entire continent and everyone knows. One of the fairies was even going to kill the dragon, but the protagonist says he will solve it alone, and so she can rest assured. He tells the dragon that they have already defeated a level 8 enemy and what his level is, and the dragon reveals that he is level 3 and has his tail between his legs. But the protagonist says it's fair and there's going to be a one-on-one battle against him, and the dragon is already excited. After that they start fighting looking like 2 idiots, and the fairies watching everything and questioning why he just doesn't get it over with. The protagonist traps him in a water trap and the dragon surrenders. The protagonist asks what the reward is. After all, he won the duel. The dragon then releases a flute and says that when he is in trouble he can play the flute and it will help him. Then they arrive at the Bull Clan's inn and rent 2 rooms, and the princess goes to have dinner there in the open air while everyone watches the perimeter. The bull tells the legend of the lake that had beautiful flowers, but one day they surprisingly withered without any explanation, and the younger fairy sister, who we will call Liam, looks upset and leaves the place. The protagonist even goes after, but she says she has nothing to share with him. She doesn't have her memories since she woke up, just the feeling that she wants to be with her sister, and since she likes him, she will pretend that she likes him too to be with her sister. Then he says he can help her remember since they will be at the lake these days, and she goes into shock and says she doesn't want to remember and attacks him, and of course all the damage is reflected back to her no matter how much the protagonist tried to warn her. Then 3 warriors appear out of nowhere and tell him to hand over the fairies. Then the protagonist communicates to Mo Fei telepathically, and she takes the other fairy, and when he gets there he calls the dragon to take care of the humans. And unfortunately for him, the dragon decides to join the bandits and only asks for a fairy as a reward, and the protagonist is left there disappointed. Then a fierce battle between the fairies and the warriors takes place. Meanwhile, the protagonist is fighting the dragon but appears to be having difficulty. Suddenly the protagonist underwater ends up finding a seal in the lake that releases great power, reaching him along with the dragon. Mo Fei follows, while the fairy who didn't like the protagonist tries to convince her sister to leave, who consequently had to protect her from the bandits. The younger sister attacks the bandits and Mo Fei goes there to help her. Meanwhile the knight is crying in the princess's room because he didn't want to execute her, but still he prepares his sword to attack her. Back to the protagonist, he is on the lake shore and meets the imposter there, who says he came to give him a warning that a new game is about to start. And suddenly Liam, who in this case is the fairy's younger sister, appears and takes care of the protagonist's wounds and is even very kind to him, unlike her current version. And we understand together with the protagonist that he is in Lian's inner world and that she has blocked some memories by even changing her name, and for some reason the imposter is helping the protagonist and he cannot be seen by her in this case. He says that he will have to conquer her like he does, and the protagonist refuses, and he then says that in that case he will exchange places with him. After the exchange, the imposter makes the baby dragon, which would be the small version of the dragon he faced, collect information about Lian, that she is from the Bull clan and that she lives collecting herbs and taking them to the city and is looking for a cure for her sick little sister. The protagonist tries to stop the imposter from going after her, but it is useless, and when she sees the imposter in front of her, a magic is activated that makes her see him as if he were the protagonist. So he uses his seduction tactics again, under the pretext of helping her, that he is good with medicine, that the cave is dangerous, and that he can help her achieve her dream, all that cheap nonsense that he uses. When she arrives at the cave, he guides her to get the herb she was looking for without waking the monster in the cave, but the little dragon, which is a miniature of that worthless dragon, goes there and wakes the beast up just to disturb it. And of course the imposter takes advantage of the situation to save Lian and create more affinity with him. He was going to attack the monster, but Liam takes him by the hands and takes him outside, thinking he was going to get hurt, but in the end they are trapped on a cliff. And even so, Liam still tries to protect the tax. She really is a strong woman. She goes after the monster and the imposter saves her, and says he will take care of everything and there was no other way, after which he stops the creature's attack with just one finger, and after that he knocks it out again with just one finger again. And then he sees the dragon's claw on the creature. He understands the whole situation and smiles. The dragon quickly starts to apologize and the imposter smiles and just says that he wanted to thank him, and I asked him to help him in another situation so since he is so good. And then he gives the dragon the biggest kick and tells him to get some rare herbs from the abyss. At that moment I laughed a lot because the dragon deserved it, and curiously the anime makes us sympathize with the imposter at that moment. She wakes up, he hands her the herbs, she thanks him and is surprised. And then she's crying because despite the herbs her sister didn't get better, and that's when the imposter says that the power of humans is limited, and he proposes something called washing of 3 lives to her, which must probably be a fairy ritual. She certainly accepts. And he goes to meet his younger sister, and we got confused here friends. Liam is actually the oldest who sympathizes with the protagonist from the beginning, and here it makes sense for her to talk about a promise she made. The next day she goes out to collect herbs and the imposter continues with his seduction tactics on her and says he likes her and realizes that she likes him too. She gets shy and leaves, and he continues with his tricks until she leaves. And then the protagonist confronts him saying that he is shameless and other things, but nothing comes of it. Then we see Liam taking care of his younger sister who really seems to be very weak. Liam then starts to gather the medicines that she is preparing in the new recipe, but it still has many side effects and it is not complete. But even so, the younger sister wants to try it, but she tells her that it is not possible, who can't take any risks and even prefers it as it is rather than getting worse, and to be patient. There's only one part of the medicine missing. The younger sister talks about the boy who gave the prescription and Lian is embarrassed, and the next day, the younger sister decides to take the medicine and go find that boy to see if he is a good person for her older sister. And the sister meets the imposter, and of course he would use his seduction tactics on her and she blushes. Would it be a bad sister in this case? So he took her for a raft ride on the Lotus Lake that was previously empty from that legend about the bull. And she remembers when she was there at the lake before, and he tells the story about her little sister getting sick from falling into the lake. The older sister was fine, but the younger sister couldn't walk anymore. And the imposter keeps acting like he's the older sister, so I believe he doesn't know yet either. Until she spits blood and feels bad, and the imposter runs to catch her and smiles, saying that the medicine of the 3 lives, even though it cures her illness, her memories and character will be affected. And maybe I don't even recognize who she is. And in reality he was saying this to her sister who was on the other side of the river, who says that everything is fine as long as she gets well and is cured, and asks her for one more favor. She says to take good care of her, and he asks if she thought about his feelings, and she apologizes crying and says that her priority is to heal her sister. And the scene changes to the younger sister waking up, who is tremendously sad thinking that everything was a dream, and even drops the soup that her sister was giving her. She's really sad that she can't walk and have been only in the dream. So the little sister takes the 3 lives medicine again and meets the imposter. Could it be her eye-poking instinct? Then he reveals that he found the final item, and she asks what it is. So he reveals that it is the blood of a close relative. Since the disease is a blood disease, blood will be needed in a large quantity to be able to cure it, and he fears that she will not be able to accept this. Of course the little sister will be devastated when she finds out. Returning home, there is a situation where the older sister pretends that she didn't see the younger one arriving, and the younger one, after talking to her sister, just cries because she can't tell her the final medicine and doesn't even want to. Later on, the imposter reveals that tomorrow will be the final day. In the meantime, we return to the princess's room, who was protected from the knight's attack by a magical barrier that the protagonist had placed over her. The princess wakes up and hugs him and tells him about everything that is happening. She is very innocent. He is embarrassed and cannot even look at her and just apologizes, then attacks her outside and she goes out with the knight to see. Mo Fei then continues his fierce battle against the bandits. In the meantime the other two fairies are captured and Mo Fei continues dodging and attacking the three bandits. The fairies get loose, the princess orders the knight to protect the fairies, but in reality he attacks them both. She thinks he's just an idiot and hit the wrong people, but he reveals his betrayal and that he came to execute them. Back to the protagonist and the imposter. The imposter hugs Lien and she says that her little sister is watching so he can just cooperate with her. So we understand that Lien is creating a whole scenario for her sister to feel angry with her, where she says that she has dedicated many years to taking care of her and that she also wants to have her own life, and of course her sister, who is listening to everything, is devastated, with her saying that she is the one without freedom and that she put 3 times more doses in her medicine. The imposter and Lien leave while the sister bursts into tears crying in a tree. After that she switches to the younger sister lying down, and now, already very hurt, she accepts the idea of the medicine, which is 10% medicine, 30% poison, and 60% her sister's blood, and that way they will continue together. At this point we understand why the previous theater that the imposter and Lien did. The two are in the cabin. Lien says that the boy declared himself to her and that he is feeling very happy, and the sister smiles and says she is happy for her. Lien says she knew her sister would support her and excitedly goes to prepare the food. In the meantime her younger sister grabs a knife kept under her pillow, and at that moment I didn't even believe what was about to happen. But when the little sister approaches, she stands still and tears start to fall, so Lien shouts at her to do it quickly, completely breaking out of the character she was playing. The younger sister then retreats, but Lien turns and goes to her and takes her hand and makes her put the knife through it and tells her to take her to the lake and they will finally find the cure. The younger sister continues crying but takes her to the lake. The next scene simply left me speechless. It's her carrying Lien while her blood is falling all over the way, and Lien is talking about how she's going to be okay and that the boy promised he would take care of her, and of course the younger sister falls into tears again as her older sister's life slowly slips away. Arriving at Lake, Lien asks the imposter to cure her and he says he will do his best, and she apologizes to her younger sister and says that she wasn't a good sister and that she would like to be her younger sister in her next life this time. And wow, what a plot twist. Could she be that younger sister who is angry at everything, or did she remain the older sister? This totally changed the scenario. It was really surprising. And the imposter reveals that from the beginning she wanted to sacrifice herself for her younger sister, but she didn't know she would die, so the only way was to make her younger sister feel jealous and hateful. The protagonist even tries to stop her from going to the lake, but he fails miserably. The younger sister says that in the next life they will be sisters again and that in the next life she will take care of her. So he gave the possibility of them both becoming fairies and being able to live together again in the afterlife. After accepting, the two were finally sealed in the river, but Lien was unable to progress in her fairy evolution and her younger sister went crazy and left her sealed in the river along with her memories that she had erased. Okay, so the youngest aggressive person in the real world is still the youngest in this inner world as well. So the protagonist goes into battle against the imposter. He is offended by playing with the lives of the two girls, but the imposter says that it was also a great loss for him losing one of them. And the protagonist continues offending him until he receives a blow and again he can't do anything. But he still gets up and says that they are not NPCs but humans like them. And the imposter asks how he is going to change this ending. The protagonist doesn't know but says he will change, and the imposter again asks how, because time is passing. In the real world the girls are in danger and in the inner world they are already at the end. What will he do? Then the imposter gives him a chance to prove that he was wrong and that he is not a hypocrite, and the game was restarted, returning to the initial state where the protagonist met Liam at the beginning of everything. And the story follows in the same way, but now with the protagonist, and at the moment of revealing the final ingredient of the recipe, the protagonist tells them to use science and Lien says that she has tried everything with science and has not succeeded. Success. So he tries a different approach. He goes to talk directly to his little sister. So he tells his older sister's whole plan to his younger sister and she believes him and says that of course he won't do anything to hurt his older sister, and says that he will tell her to invite him to lunch because he seems to be a good person. The protagonist smiles at the imposter and the imposter smiles back, perhaps giving a vote of confidence. So on the day the tragedy would happen, now the protagonist is with the two of them having dinner and everything seems to be going well. Everyone is in a good mood and the little sister is the one who made the food, and that's my friends. Lien and the protagonist are blacking out at the table. Apparently the little sister put sleeping pills in the food, and the younger sister reveals that her older sister actually has a heart disease, and to clear the guilt she is always with her. This is new information. We didn't know that the other one was sick too, so the younger sister decides to sacrifice herself so that the older sister can have a long and happy life. The protagonist wakes up and runs to the lake, and the situation is the same. The only thing that has changed is the sacrificed sister. And the protagonist asks the imposter for another opportunity, and the imposter gives him one last opportunity. And again Lien meets the protagonist at the lake, and this time we follow the entire route that the imposter had taken, only with the protagonist, and we are again in the scenario where the younger sister takes the knife and goes to the older sister. The imposter tells you not to waste your money, last chance, and as soon as the younger sister attacks he uses the flower to transform them into fairies. But he follows his own route and stops both before the tragedy, and he scolds both of them there about everything that happened and how many people with disabilities can continue to fight for their lives, and that Lien needs her life and that she continues to follow. They both start crying and Lien apologizes to her younger sister for creating a whole scenario for her to hate her. And he leaves the house feeling victorious, but the world falls apart. After all, that world is made up of the memories that occurred, and there is no way the world could exist without those events. And the protagonist collapses after all his effort was worthless, and he starts crying, wondering if there really is no other way. And a miniature of the younger sister appears and says that it wasn't for nothing, because thanks to him she understood her true feelings and is ready to face her past that she had forgotten and continue following, and kisses him, surprising him in his normal form. And the imposter congratulates him but makes fun of him. He hasn't been able to change anything, but the younger sister defends him and says she will help him return to his world, as he may not be able to change the past but he can change the future, and gives him a push to get back to reality. Then the dragon cub goes along too and says that if he can come back he will do whatever the protagonist wants, and the protagonist accepts. The imposter says that this time he will take it as he approved in the game, and says goodbye. Finally, the protagonist returns with the dragon, who fiercely attacks the bandits, and the princess celebrates and the fairies are surprised. He puts the princess on the dragon to protect her and prepares for battle together with the fairies. Then the confrontation begins, and the little fairy sister hugs him and the fusion begins. The knight even tries to stop it, but it is useless. And so he began his form, now with a blue countenance, and with a different power than when he fused with the fey hand, now using the water element that allows different forms of magic manipulation. He quickly restricts the knight's movements and then goes after some bandits, saving the Lien and completely executing one of the bandits. Our protagonist feels like Goku with superior instinct. No attack is a problem for him, and he converts everything back to the enemy, truly a devastating and very useful power, and execute the second bandit. Meanwhile, the third bandit is attacking the dragon, but not for long. He is easily immobilized and then gets beaten beautifully by our protagonist, which he executes after a devastating sequence of blows. And the protagonist even jokes that he is now the king of water. The knight frees himself from the ice prison and activates his most powerful attack. The protagonist jokes that this way the last episode will be more exciting, and it fuses with Mo Fei, making a double fusion of fairies and thus creating a new power that is totally overpowering. The knight doesn't have the slightest chance. Just with the pressure of power he's already on his knees. He even goes up, but the protagonist uses his skills to glide over the water and uses an ice spear to block attacks. Several spear attacks versus the knight's sword are launched. The protagonist demonstrates great mastery with the spear. Several ice blades are thrown at the knight, who blocks some with great difficulty. The protagonist shows a serene calm, while the knight lets out his despair. He uses a speed technique to multiply himself and goes after the protagonist with everything he has. But the protagonist activates his cyclone magic, hitting everyone and revealing the real one that is thrown away. The knight is completely left alone, and the protagonist is preparing to deliver his final blow. A kind of janky lady, but the princess stops him. He says he changed his personality and asks if he became arrogant because of his long hair. He comes to his senses and gets rid of the energy sphere, and he apologizes to her, but she turns to the knight and scolds him, asking him why he's fighting the protagonist if he knows he won't win against him, and she doesn't want to see him dead. The knight destabilizes her emotionally. She hugs him, but he still pushes her away and gets up. She asks if they will see each other again, and he replies that it won't do her any good and leaves while she bursts into tears. In the meantime, the lake flowers bloom, and he sees the twin flower that gave rise to the two fairies. And the younger fairy sister says she is very grateful for the new life he gave her, but that she distrusted her older sister and that she cannot forgive herself, and that in that lake where her older sister rests, and there she will return. Here things got blurry. We have to be detectives to decipher this anime. So all this time the fairy she called her big sister wasn't her big sister, but just another fairy she tried to supply her big sister's emotions that she did not evolve and that she had already erased her memories. Then the fairy asks if the older sister is leaving. Look, I really don't know if the subtitles are wrong. I tried to understand it the best way. You who understood better explain it to me here in the comments. So the younger sister says goodbye to everyone and says that she will protect the lake, and even jokes that Mo Fei won't need to be jealous anymore, and she is embarrassed by her rude way and says not to worry about him, that she will do it. Protect. Then the fairy, who in theory would be the older sister, says goodbye very sad and says that she will always be her family, and the younger sister says goodbye in tears. The other fairy returns to the manual and says she will continue with it, and then he and Mo Fei talk. So Mo Fei says some words to motivate him and tells him to try hard, and he agrees. And he calls the princess to go away on the dragon. So only now in the last episode does she realize that the girls were fairies. Really very silly. She is one of the best characters. And the princess gives a fairy seed to the protagonist and he is amazed. And here we go again. What a saga, huh friends? Firstly, I wanted to thank all of you who followed, liked, and commented on the videos. You are the ones who motivate me. If we made it to the end, it was thanks to you. Ready for the next saga? Comment here which one you would like. Sign up now and come to Bando if you arrived here. Thanks again for the like, and I'll stay here. We're together, Bando.